Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in Volodar's direction where the advances by the Russians have been clarified following the Russian APC that went through into the end of the road before getting hit by artillery. It was then clarified that the Russians did manage to make an advance halfway across, which they have consolidated. However, the second part is not clear. It is still under Ukrainian control. Similar to the case with the Chasiv Yar direction, where a Russian armored personnel carrier managed to drop off some infantry, they never consolidated those gains. It makes it clear that it was an overextension, a mistake, rather than a breakthrough. Similarly, here in the north, the Russians have managed to capture another forest line, so we see that the Russians have managed to advance both in the central parts and in the northern parts towards the Vodiane direction and Volodar direction along the road between Volodar and Konstantinivka here to the north. Further north in the direction of Avdiivka, section of the front line by Novoalexandrivka, the Russians have advanced in the western part, capturing the rest of the fortified positions in the direction of Vostyshenka and Timofeevka. This is following the capture of Luzvatsky to the south. So we see that the Russians continue offensive operations west of Novoalexandrivka, and in the north, the area of control has been expanded by the Russians to the flank of Vostyshenka. So we're seeing that offensive operations continue in the direction of Vostyshenka and to both sides of it to expand the flanks in the direction of Timofeevka and Baranivka. The objective of the Russian operations here is to move in the direction of the intersection between Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka, and through that there is this fortified position ahead of Vostyshenka, which the Russians have closed in on, but have not yet started attacking. This is due to the well-fortified position where the Russians have now captured the fortified positions ahead of it, meaning that they can now flank Vostyshenka from whether it be the north or the south. At the same time, they can advance in the direction of Timofeevka and flank it from the south completely, bypassing Vostyshenka. They can continue fighting along the southern flank or the northern flank, or they can also combine those assaults and do all three at the same time. We see that the Russians typically do all three at the same time on a wide front as they advance continuously across the entirety of the front line rather than concentrating their forces in one area, which would allow for a breakthrough, but would also be a more risky operation. In the direction of New York, the Ukrainians have counterattacked in the direction of the apartment complex area here in the western part of the town, in which the Ukrainians have managed to recapture a few streets. However, the Russians still hold their positions in the apartment complex area. I previously mentioned that the apartment complex area here is the strongest position that the Russians can pick up in the area. This means that the Russians, if they lose their apartment complex area, would be dealt a significant blow to their positions here in New York and would likely be pushed out again. This is why heavy fighting is taking place in the apartment complex area, where the Russians and the Ukrainians are facing off over that area specifically. The new Ukrainian reinforcements that arrived from other parts of the front line are being sent directly to that point to recapture the apartment complex area, which would allow the Ukrainians to re-strengthen their positions. Some argue that the Russian advance here into New York is one that is reminiscent of a fire pocket that the Ukrainians are attacking both flanks, therefore the Russians are taking heavy casualties within it. This, however, is not a very strong opinion. The main reason is that the Russians have been able to push to the sides, creating a wider area in which they are present. The main route into the point as well is through a tunnel where they avoid majority of the fighting through that, and this is why the pushing to the sides came after the long distance advance that is due to the tunnel being used. And finally, with the apartment complex area in the north and the river lines in the northeast and northwest, it is easier for the Russians to hold these positions without any significant counterattacks. Therefore, the Russians are spread thinly across the entire area with a few focus points, and even if the Ukrainians completely cut off this area, there is still the supply line through the tunnel, which the Russians can make use of, which takes place somewhere here in the center. So therefore, the Russians are not really taking significant casualties. They instead have managed to consolidate their positions and strengthen their positions ahead of the Ukrainians reacting with counterattacks such as this one in the apartment complex area. In the direction of Toretsk, the Russians have made a small advance here along Selishny, capturing the school area here to the south of the apartment complex area and east of the second line of defense. So we see continuous small-scale advance in the direction of the second line of defense here east of Toretsk towards the heights in the area. We see heavy fighting in the Toretsk direction as well. In the direction of Chasiv Yar, the Russians have managed to capture the rest of Kalinina along the canal line. We also see fighting in the final parts along the canal line where the Russians are looking to gain control over the Ukrainian fortified positions. The northern part of Kalinina remains under Ukrainian control. However, it is now completely isolated as Russians have managed to capture the forest line here to the north of it. This leads to no roads being available towards the northern part of Kalinina. However, it is likely that infantry and other small-scale units can move between the canal normally, even though it is somewhat of a river line. So Ukrainian soldiers can move in between that area in the north of Kalinina through the canal without any crossings. At the same time, there is a crossing here to the north, and infantry can just easily move through the forest area as well. However, armored vehicles would have a difficult time moving through without any of the roads or crossings available. The fighting is moving further north as the Russians may be looking to cross over the canal line at a wider point where they would be attacking Chasiv Yar from the northern and southern flanks rather than directly towards Chasiv Yar, and expanding the front line will also allow the Russians to make use of the crossings that are already available to them. As the wider the front line, the more area they have to work with. That allows them to cross over, and the more area they can cross over from, the easier it is to make a crossing, as the Ukrainians would have a wider area to keep watch of. And a crossing is a very sensitive operation that requires a lot of preparation. So we see that the Russians are moving on to the next phase of the fighting here east of Chasiv Yar, which is to capture Hrigorivka to the north, align the front line to the canal line in the northern direction as well, before starting a crossing operation across the canal line and start the real battle of Chasiv Yar and not just the micro-district. Further north here in the direction of Kislivka, the Russians have made a small advance along the railway. This is to the south of Stepova-Novoselivka. The Russians have not made any significant push towards Stepova-Novoselivka. There has been a few independent armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles moving along the front to gain control over the next forest line after the next forest line in the northern and eastern parts, following the capture of Ivanivka, and now we're seeing small-scale operations to the south as well, where positional fighting allows Russians to get closer to Stepova-Novoselivka ahead of an assault towards the village, which would look to capture it. The Ukrainians still have fortified positions in the area that they are in control of. However, following the redirection of troops here from this section of the front line to the Kharkiv section of the front line, the Ukrainians have been unable to properly defend this area, leading to multiple Russian captures in this section of the front line. In the direction of Lipsy, the Russians have managed to recapture a small part of the area that the Ukrainians managed to capture north of Hlyboke. This starts the counterattack of the Russians as they are looking to regain control of the area and secure the northern flank of Hlyboke, and at the same time launch counterattacks within the village itself to fully regain control of it. So you see that the Russians are here attempting to regain control over the area and regain the initiative in the Hlyboke direction of the front line. Talking about a redirection of forces, according to Clement Molin, who has been doing a lot of this map stuff and the fortified positions, thanks to him, the Russian offensive on Kharkiv had a single objective: to divert Ukrainian attention. More than 8 Ukrainian maneuver brigades deployed in Kharkiv. The real Russian victory is having succeeded in the diversion. If we take a look at the map, we see that the Ukrainians have moved 1 brigade to the Sumy region, 8.5 additional brigades to the Kharkiv region, from which 2 of them came from the Kupiansk direction. The area between Kupiansk and Kalinina is still the same. The Kalinina direction has had an additional 1.5 brigades sent to that direction. Siversk direction has lost a half a brigade. Chasiv Yar has lost 2.5. The Toretsk direction has seen an additional 4 brigades moved in that direction. The Avdiivka section has lost a half, and the Volodar section has lost 2. The Vremetsky area has gained an additional brigade. There's been 1 moved from the rear and 1 moved from Zaporizhia and 2 moved from the Kherson direction. And on this second map, we see not just the mechanized brigades which have been moved around, but the numbering of the balance between mechanized and infantry / National Guard and other brigades that are not as mobile and elite as the mechanized ones. We see in the Sumy direction there is 2 mechanized and 2 infantry brigades. In the Kharkiv direction, there's 8.5 mechanized and 10 infantry brigades. That's 18.5 brigades in the Kharkiv direction against the few thousand soldiers that the Russians are using in that direction. In the Kupiansk direction, there's 6 mechanized and 2 infantry. In between Kupiansk and Kalinina, there's 4 mechanized and 5 infantry. In the Kalinina direction, 7 mechanized and 1 infantry. In the Siversk direction, 4.5 mechanized and 0 infantry brigades. In the Chasiv Yar direction, 6.5 and 3.5. Further south in the Toretsk direction, 5 and 2. In the Avdiivka, 8.5 and 2. Further south, 5 to 3. In the Vremetsky 3.5 and 8. And in the Zaporizhia front, 4 to 5. In the rear, there's 5 mechanized and 9 infantry brigades. And in the Kherson direction, there's 2 mechanized and 5 infantry brigades. So we still see that there's a few brigades, 14 brigades here in the rear, which could be redirected according to where the Ukrainians need additional reinforcements. But if that is the case, then there simply is not enough for the Ukrainians to launch a future counterattack. This is why the Ukrainians want to avoid deploying these additional troops. With this, we see that there are some parts of the front which rely mostly on mechanized units and other points that rely mostly on infantry units, depending on the nature of the battlefield. In the Kalinina and Kupiansk direction, we see mostly mechanized, and this is due to the open fields in the area. In between, there's this forest patch, there's this river line, and the Ukrainians are making use of the fortified positions in the area, which is why there's a large concentration of infantry. In the Siversk front, again, it is mostly open fields, and the fortified positions there are scarce, and the Russians capture them one by one. In the Chasiv Yar direction, it is a mix of both the mechanized and the infantry, somewhat 60-30%, and this allows the Ukrainians to both have people manning the fortified positions and mechanized units to move around and according to the Russian movements. And similarly, the Donetsk section of the front line is where the majority of the forces of the Ukrainians are. From Siversk and down to the Volodar section, there is dozens of brigades compared to any other section of the front line, and this is where the Russian offensive operation is the toughest and hardest on the Ukrainian positions. This also shows why there's no significant push by the Russians in the south, as the Ukrainians still have a significant presence there as well. This is some great mapping. Make sure to follow Clement Molin for what he has done. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.